On the subject of discipline, I want to get into this because I think it's important, and I think that our society has gone a bit astray. Corporal punishment, or physical discipline, whatever you want to call it, has very much fallen out of style these days. A lot of people believe that it's harmful to the child. It brings about a series of negative outcomes. And when the Bible speaks of discipline, it speaks of the rod. Now, one could make the case that the Bible uses the rod as a metaphor for discipline just because that is what was most often used at the time. It's not necessarily meant to be taken as an endorsement of corporal punishment. But I think the frequency with which the rod is mentioned in correlation with discipline shows that God intends that some discipline be physical. Now, a lot of studies have been done that allegedly show that physical discipline is harmful to the child. The issue with most of those studies is that there is not a proper definition of corporal punishment, particularly insofar as it is distinct from physical abuse.
Yeah, and let's just stop right there and talk about that a little bit, because I've read a few of those studies myself, and they are lumping it together. Some of these studies you read, and they're lumping what I would call appropriate corporal punishment with actual child abuse, and they're looking at the outcomes with all of them lumped together, which is about as far from what should be as you can get, right? Not all the studies do that, but some of them do. But there is a lack of definition about what good corporal punishment looks like, and I have my opinions on it. And let me first say this relative to the studies. Now, I've lived a while, and I've seen all types of households. I've seen all types of adults come out of different households. The ones that I have seen that where corporal punishment was administered properly and was done in the larger context of a loving, nurturing home has always had very positive outcomes, right? Abusing a child is going to have a negative outcome.
Of course. So
if I might just give just a couple of definitions on my side, just to clarify what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Me personally, when we say corporal punishment, I do not think a parent should ever strike a child with their hand, right? I don't. There's a couple of reasons. I think there could be a psychological reason there. The Bible specifically says rod.
Yes.
It doesn't say hand, and so the other reason is from a practical standpoint. A human hand, especially if a parent gets a little bit out of control, could actually do physical harm to the child. And corporal punishment should not risk harm to the child. That is not the intent, right? The intent is a physical pain. It is a pain, but it's not anything that would produce any kind of a long-term harm, right? If you spank a child with a very lightweight instrument, it produces a stinging result that is very unpleasant to the child. And they understand that, hey, when I don't follow the instructions of my dad, this is going to be the outcome. And what you're really telling them there is that there is an outcome or a result to their disobedience, right? And I think that's what we're missing a lot in just our society in general. People don't understand, hey, if I do this thing, this is going to be the outcome. We seem to have regressed in our society to kind of a let's live in the moment kind of a standpoint. And so that's why I think it's so important. You have to be very clear on, hey, if you do this, this will happen, and then you have to follow through on it. I used corporal punishment on y'all when y'all were coming up. And I would say in my early days, I probably didn't do it all as well as I should have. I learned some things as I went along. And, one of the things I did learn was, two big things. Don't strike with a hand, and don't administer it when you're mad, right? Yes. Let yourself cool off, because we can get angry with what kids do, and so we don't need to do that. Give yourself a little bit of a cooling off period. It still needs to be close to the event, but it doesn't need to be while you're angry, yes. Right? Just like all the other things in parenting, administering corporal punishment correctly takes a lot of discipline, a lot of self-discipline, mm-hmm. right? And I do think men are better at it in general, again, speaking in general terms, because we tend to be able to segment our lives better. We can say, hey, I love this child, but I'm going to discipline this child. Those two things can exist at the same time.
Right.
Females in general have a harder time with that. Mm-hmm. We don't. So I do think men have a natural bent to be better disciplinarians, but that doesn't mean moms can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that what you said about not doing it when you're angry is one of the most key points. We know that the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
Right.
That's what the Bible tells us. And there is a much different psychological implication when your parent strikes you when they're angry and when your parent strikes you when they're calm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I can never recall a time from my childhood when I was disciplined physically that I became angry with you. Mm-hmm. Or that I took it as an indication that you didn't love me.
Right.
Or that you were taking your anger out on me. And I think that is very important. And I think, to go back to the studies that have been done that are against corporal punishment, a lot of the time that was not clear. Mm-hmm. That the corporal punishment was administered by a parent who was not angry, who was not just acting impulsively mm-hmm. because they were upset with their child.
Right.
And I also saw in those studies that the people being studied were disciplining their children, in some cases, not speaking of all of them, of course, way more often than I would have imagined, like multiple times a week.
Yeah.
And one thing that you guys have taught us is that if you administer corporal punishment properly, you will not have to do it very often. And
very, very rare, actually.
I was a pretty conscientious kid, but I was disciplined physically very few times growing up. And I think that should be the expectation.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not an everyday or multiple times a day kind of a situation. I mean, you might go through a phase where it increases slightly based on, the development of the kid. But yeah, it's rare. And because here's the thing, when they know you will do it, when you will follow through, you don't get to that point, right? I mean, it's just that simple. Mm-hmm. Just a couple of observations here. I have seen numerous times where people would spank their child, with their hand, mm-hmm. and they get their child by the arm and they do like this right here, mm-hmm. and it's useless, right? One thing that we don't like, and probably the internet would blow up over this, but when you apply corporal punishment, it needs to hurt, mm-hmm. okay? Not hurt in a way that you're going to cause any physical damage, right? When y'all were small, one of my favorite tools for administering corporal punishment was a zip tie, right? It was a large zip tie. It was about that long, and it was a real heavy-duty zip tie. I could swing that zip tie with all of my human strength. I could not have done you any physical harm, okay? But when it hit your leg, it stung, right? Just like taking a big rubber band, and popping it, how it stings.
Right.
It's an unpleasant sensation, but it does not in any way risk long-term physical. It's not going to break any bones or bruise anything or do anything like that, but it is a stinging result that is very unpleasant. And if you're not doing something that's unpleasant, right, if you're spanking, basically it's just showing the child that you're upset, and it doesn't really have that physical sensation of unpleasantness, you're missing out there. That's not going to produce the result you want.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I just think one more thing to say before we leave this. Mm-hmm. There does come an age that is too old for corporal punishment.
Absolutely.
The older the child gets, the more there's a risk of humiliating them or just simply being ineffective. I mean, the larger a child is, the harder it is to hurt them. You know,
Yes.
I remember the last times that I was disciplined physically, it just did not have the same effect as when I was younger. It just didn't hurt as much. I was just bigger and tougher.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I don't know when the last time we used corporal punishment on you and your siblings was, but it's probably in that 10 to 11-year-old range, I'm guessing. Mm-hmm. You know, after that, there are other methods because kids develop things that they want, and you can discipline them by withholding things from them.
Yes.
That's much more painful than a temporary spanking, right?
And they're of a level of mental sophistication such that it's not so necessary to show the detrimental effect of their actions.
Yes.
You can actually explain to them why what they're doing is wrong and the effect that it'll have, and they'll understand it.
Yeah, the one thing that I always did when y'all got older, you know, beyond that point of corporal punishment, when I discussed the rules, I would say, okay, here are the rules, and if you break the rules, here's the outcome, right? Okay, and then when you broke the rules, what I would tell you is, look, I'm not doing this to you. You did this to yourself because I told you what the rule was. I told you what the outcome was. You broke the rule, now you're getting the outcome. That was your decision. That's not my decision. I'm just enforcing the rules, right? And so once children get to that point, you don't have to use corporal punishment on them anymore when they get that.
Yeah.
You know, when you can take away cell phones and video games and hobbies, whatever those things are that become very important to children, you have other tools to work with.
Mm-hmm.